Thank you, Scarlett. Good afternoon, everybody. Great pleasure for me also to be here in this discussion. And I would like to make a few remarks to also prep ourselves for hopefully an interactive session afterwards that I call Digital Sovereignty, Neutrality, and Return Action. Now, digital sovereignty is a bit of a provocation, and I'm sure it will trigger, we can try to unpack whether it even exists, whether that is even a realistic ambition. But I think what I would like to, what we try to do today is to look at the risks and avenues to do digital supply chains and what are they for humanitarian organizations specifically. Now, I have to immediately, as a disclosure, I have to say that I'm coming from the operational side. So I have been for years on the operational side, Middle East Director, Deputy Director General. I now run the digital transformation of the Icsc because we feel it has to be people-centric. It is about the sense on how can we ensure that what we have to do according to the Geneva Convention's mandate is done in the most people-centric way. So that means, of course, using technology, but not being driven by technology. And I will try to talk a little bit about some of the role, the mandate, the digital transformation, the risk of cyber crossfire. You see the menu. Now, this looks like a sort of 4-hour speech, but I will try to do that in 10, 12 minutes. So I'll be relatively superficial here in the hope that we can perhaps afterwards come back to some of the issues in greater detail in a more interactive format with my fellow panel members. So very briefly, for the ones who may not know who Icsc is, so we are an organization mandated to protect and assist people in situations of armed conflict. We are in over 100 countries present with some 20,000 staff members. We also try to promote the application of international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, and Ed alluded to all the questions that, of course, technology bring about with regard to warfare, and we can also come back to those. And importantly, we often serve as neutral intermediary between two parties, so they have to trust us. They may not like us, because if you're a neutral intermediary between two sides, you aren't a friend of any of the sides. But trust and the way we manage the confidential data that we have is, of course, absolutely central. So we work according to the principles of humanity and impartiality, meaning we help as per needs without taking side. And in order to do that, and that's not ethical principles, it's more operational principles, we have to be neutral. You can't do that if you are taking side. And we have, of course, to have the necessary independence not to be under any political injunction. And I will be very brief on that one, but of course, talking about digital transformation for us at the Icsc, it's more like how do we adjust to a world that is digitally disrupted? So it's not just the technological upscaling. There is part of that too. But it is really indeed, and perhaps I point to point 4, to apply data protection, digital cyber information security standards that preserve the integrity, confidentiality, and availability of information systems and data. If one of you was, for instance, a political detainee and you were afraid, of repression of our families, you would probably want that what you tell the Icsc or your data really stays in the hand of the Icsc. Or Icsc people going around war zones, crossing front lines, often also see information that may be militarily exploitable. So again, these are not necessarily personal data, but they are data that have to stay with us, including the dialogue we discussed with over 400 non-state armed groups. Many of them are considered as terrorist groups by states. So of course, if you talk between Daesh and the Pentagon, you have to control your data. You can't just have, what we see, what we discuss in the open. That would also apply to the conduct of hostilities. And it's all about really the trust that we need to have in a people-centric approach. I think the whole issue of autonomous weapons, we come perhaps back in the discussion, because it's, of course, a particularly interesting element for artificial intelligence, ethics policy, and international humanitarian law. Now, what I want to say, to stay a little bit on the issue of, I just have to see why it doesn't seem to change. Yeah, it doesn't seem to react any longer. It seems to be stuck. I want to talk a little bit about what I would call the risk of, it is blocked. The risk of cyber crossfire. It doesn't matter if you don't have the slides. what is interesting is that in the real world, we think, of course, about, here we go, in the real risk, in the real world, in the analog world, we think very much, where would we have a delegation? Would we put our delegation next to a military camp? How would we equip it? Where would we situate it? So we are quite good at, if we drive, I don't know, through the mountains of northern Ethiopia, which route you take, who do you talk to? I think we have decades of experience as Icsc to try to build the acceptance and the trust with belligerents and the civilian population. Now, in the cyberspace, if you allow me this analogy, we have to ask ourselves, how do we connect with the actors in the cyberspace? Where do we have our data? How do we route them? What can happen to us? And we have, in a way, to think about cyberspace in a way that, of course, we are acutely aware that disruption of digital supply chains disrupt us. We are very much depending for our operational continuity and our delivery on these supply chains. However, if they are disrupted, that may be generally, or because we are targeted, this has, of course, very important impact on our operations. And it can really affect our business continuity. We also have to think, and that's perhaps something we can unpack further in our discussion about the geopolitics of technology. We have said for quite a while, as an organization that, has to work on all sides, the kind of technology we use and access to is probably becoming more and more a political challenge as such. We have seen that the UN, I heard, had some problems with conferences because some of the states basically said we can't use that and that software because we are under sanctions. So they had actually a difficulty to even dialogue or to vote. Voting is also an interesting one. Who controls the software for voting in the multilateral realm? So we have all these questions, the technology. Today, we can still use technology stacks for all our operations, from Russia, China, Western world, Africa, Asia, you name it. But perhaps in 5-10 years, what kind of technology stacks can we use? Or would people sort of say, well, actually, if you use technology A, that's, for us, a political message. Or the internet would become a splinternet. And we would suddenly realize that we actually, as a global organization working in places few other organizations even set foot into, what kind of technology do you use and who controls the technology? And I think their perception is very important. So of course we have to be immune to hacking, to unlawful access. I mean, you can suffer it. We can also talk about that later. We had a very bad cyber attack recently, a data breach on which I can talk. But it's also the lawful access. So it's the question, do we accept that a country or its justice system can access, without us knowing it, depending on whether there is a gag order arrangement, is that a problem or not? And that is indeed a problem with some of the technology stacks that we use and where we try to sort of find ways on what data do we have in which system. Now, some people tell me, but is that really so bad? Okay, the American Justice Cloud Act would perhaps look at certain of data. Why is that such an issue? I mean, it's a rule of law. But then if as a neutral, independent actor, you have to flip it around and sort of say, well, I may have to explain that in my next contact with Hezbollah. And sort of say, it's okay for us that the US justice could have access. Or you flip it around, and I'm not trying to equate wrongly what perhaps can't be equated, but would it be easy, for instance, if we chose a Chinese or a Russian technology stack and we would tell Western belligerents, Chinese or Russian justice could possibly have access? I'm not trying to equate now. I'm just sort of saying perception matters. And if you try to have the trust of people who are very much at odds, at loggerheads, hate each other, fight each other, kill each other, it very much matters on how you control your data. Now, in this sense, we have to balance that the kind of autarky is a dream. I don't believe that we sort of can, in a workshop, bricoler, cobble together our own systems and that those would work. But we have to try to find technological solutions, networks that are tested, proved, but at the same time, we have indeed to apply in a way certain demands that we have to technology, and that's perhaps where we come also to the overall piece of research and development. In all honesty, what we need doesn't exist currently. And that's a real problem. So we can, of course, settle with all sorts of complication and complex architectures of what is kept where and how we use which technology. We can try to settle for what is commercially available, or we can try to engage with a number of partners, private, academia. ÖPFL is, of course, a good example. Microsoft is an example, but we also are in dialogue with other tech companies from other parts of the world, and trying also to throw perhaps challenges to them, sort of say, a humanitarian organization, our stakes in a way are not different to the stakes of others, but it's like a magnifying glass. What in Switzerland is perhaps the embarrassment of a privacy intrusion can become a question of life and death if your data is taken from you in Afghanistan and falls in the wrong hands. And in this sense, I believe that perhaps the humanitarian action, which is, of course, let's face it, in the global picture of how we use artificial intelligence, a fringe case. It's I wouldn't say it's irrelevant, but it's a tiny little sideshow. But the interest it may have for the larger world is that it magnifies issues that probably, mutatis mutandis, could also apply to other sectors and hold thus certain lessons. Now I will speed up. I sort of feel the vibes from Scarlett that I should not be overly long, and just would briefly say on digital sovereignty for humanitarian actors. Of course, digital sovereignty, we can discuss it afterwards, whether that concept even makes sense, and we have to put it in inverted commas. But clearly, data sovereignty is for us an ambition that we would like to have. To say it very naively, we simply want to control the use location processing of our data. And cloud technology, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, has certain challenges in this sense. Now, digital sovereignty is, of course, even far greater, because it also looks at the hardware, what kind of hardware, backdoors, etc. I think it's probably out of the reach to think about digital sovereignty, but we have to think about what it means. What are these dependencies, and how do we actually manage them in the best possible way? I accelerate, I can come back with greater detail to some of these points. And I think if you now look at some of the mitigating approaches, what strikes me in the discussions I have with tech companies and governments and others is you normally talk to people who only talk about the legal part of it, and then you talk to the people who look at the technical part of it, and you look at the people who have the organizational part of it. But the sad truth is that if you don't manage to combine these 2-3 strands, you don't get anywhere. And I still believe in my observation that very often the discussion happens either among lawyers or among technologists. And they know each other's world, but they find it difficult often to connect. And I think this connection will be absolutely critical. So, on the slide you see a couple of sort of high-level elements that would allow us to probably go a certain length in the right direction. I believe adopting a zero-trust approach to IT security, perhaps that will resonate with some of the elements that the speakers after me will come up with. I think you see the other points, and in order to leave more room for the discussion afterwards, I'll stop here. Thank you.